In the shattered hive ruins of Terres Majoris, 17 billion lives held their breath, waiting to learn what they were worth to beings the people called angels. When the Space Marines finally came, they did not arrive with speeches or promises. They arrived with ledgers, cold, precise arithmetic that would decide who might be carried through the coming storm and who would be spent to buy time. The city had once been a jewel of stone and light. Then war painted the skies a bruised, rusted red, and the wind tasted of iron, ash, and scorched plascrete. Long before the first chitinous shapes reached the horizon, the Tyranid vanguard had begun its relentless crawl across the continents, an advancing ocean of hunger that stripped settlements down to bone and dust. The planetary governor sent plea after plea into the void, 17 astropathic cries in total, each more frantic than the last, each one flung outward like a drowning man's final shout. The answer, when it came, was small in number and enormous in meaning. 3 Thunderhawk gunships cutting down through the smoke, their hulls marked in crimson and pale bone, the colors of the angels sanguinary. Across Terres Majoris, people surged to windows, rooftops, and balconies. Streets became rivers of bodies. For a moment, the city forgot how to be afraid and remembered how to hope, watching those gunships descend like meteor flares through a suffocating sky. Children pointed, laughing at the spectacle. Parents cried openly, clutching one another with shaking hands. In their minds, the Emperor's angels of death had come to save them from the Xenos' nightmare rushing toward their walls. They weren't wrong about salvation. They were wrong about the price. Captain Dante Vex of the Third Company stood atop the highest spire of the governor's palace, a statue of ceramite and purpose. From that height, he took in the sprawl of the metropolis, tower blocks stacked like cliffs, transit arteries like veins, manufactoria belching smoke into the already dying light. His auto senses drank in the world as data, population density, shelter capacity, fuel reserves, food stores, medical stockpiles, defensive geometry. Every district washed across his vision in layers of tactical meaning, the city reduced into zones of value, industry, transit, armories, HAB sectors, each tagged with the same indifferent clarity as a map of artillery targets. He heard the enemy before the city did, not as a roar, nothing so simple. It was a deep, crawling vibration that seemed to come from the planet's bones, a tremor that rode up through foundations and walls and into the bodies of everyone still alive inside the perimeter, like the pulse of something vast and ancient waking beneath the ground. The most sensitive felt it first as unease. People double-checked locks. They kept children closer. They stared down streets that suddenly felt too long, too empty, too exposed. Vex knew that sound. He had heard it on other worlds, under other skies, when the great devourer came with its endless, patient appetite. It was the motion of countless organisms acting as one will, trillions of living weapons perfected by evolution and slaughter, all moving toward a single conclusion. By his estimate, the swarm was hours from the outer line. Perhaps less. He opened the Vox. His words snapped through the network like a guillotine blade. Begin assessment protocol. All squads confirm readiness. Contingencies are active. Below, the city kept working itself raw. For weeks, refugees from the outskirts had poured in, carrying stories no sane mind wanted to accept. Towns gone silent overnight, forests stripped bare, roads littered with abandoned vehicles and prayers. Barricades of scrap and broken furniture clogged major avenues. Civilian defense forces, PDF remnants and volunteers manned checkpoints with laser guns held in hands that didn't quite know how to hold them. Distribution centers ran day and night, rationing dwindling supplies to an ever-thickening mass of displaced families. In parks and plazas, camps spread like a disease. Tents and tarps, fires fueled by smashed debris. People huddled together to trade rumors and recite litanies. Children played at being soldiers between rows of canvas, copying the stances they'd seen in propaganda reels, not realizing they were rehearsing for a reality no game could soften. The old sat in tight circles, faces carved by too many endings that hadn't quite ended. Too many catastrophes survived, too many goodbyes swallowed, too many days when the world looked ready to collapse. None of them knew what was happening behind the palace's sealed doors. None of them could imagine that their lives were already being weighed on scales built for war. The assessment protocol was not improvisation. It was doctrine, refined across centuries of siegecraft, honed by defeats that cost worlds, perfected in simulations that assumed the worst because the worst was usually true. It existed for one purpose. When you cannot save everyone, you decide who must be saved first. Among the Astartes, it carried different names, spoken quietly when mortals weren't meant to hear. Triage at planetary scale, the Emperor's calculus, necessity made law. The people of Turs Majorus had their own words for it. Words they would only learn when learning no longer helped. Brother Sergeant Maximus studied the feeds pouring across his helm display as his squad established observation points through the middle sectors. The fear was visible even without enhanced sight, faces tight, eyes darting, hands restless. With enhanced senses, it was overwhelming. Sweat, chemical stress signatures, the sharp animal scent of prey. The city's population became numbers. Numbers became categories. Age, health, skills, aptitudes, genetic markers, psychological resilience, likelihood of staying useful under sustained terror. Each person, each life, flattened into a data point within a merciless matrix. Reports crackled over the Vox from teams scattered across the sprawl. Sector 77. Strong defensive geometry. Structural stability holding. Industrial Zone 12. Output at acceptable levels. Workforce performance above baseline. Residential Block 49. Agitation rising. Risk of unrest. Recommend containment if preservation measures initiate. Each update sharpened the larger picture. The city was being dissected with methodical care. Streets were evaluated as lanes of retreat or channels of fire. Buildings were judged by thickness of walls, access points, capacity for sheltering assets. Whole neighborhoods were scored for whether they were worth defending or worth trading. Deep beneath the palace, Tech Marine Kareth linked himself into the city's cogitation backbone. Mechadendrites slid into data ports with practiced ease. His awareness expanded until infrastructure became sensation. The power grid, a lattice of light, water lines, a branching circulatory system, transit routes, a nervous network pulsing with movement and failure points. He spoke in clipped Binharic bursts, offering reverent requests to machine spirits and demanding diagnostics as if reading prayers from steel. The cogitators answered with torrents of information that would have burned out a human mind. Population registers, inventory manifests, production timetables, maintenance records, criminal histories, medical files, education logs, service rosters, screening outcomes, psychological evaluations. Every citizen existed somewhere in those streams, catalogued, rated, tracked, because in the Imperium, order always walked with surveillance. Kareth could summon a man's birth record and his loyalty grade, a woman's tax burden and her health risk, a family's connections and their history of discipline. He could trace bloodlines, predict vulnerability to illness, flag instability, measure productivity, estimate consumption. All of it fed upward to Captain Vex, still motionless, still listening, his mind turning a living city into a war plan. The Tyrannid horde drew closer, near enough that his enhanced hearing could separate textures within the collective noise, the skittering rush of gaunts by the million, the heavier, deliberate cadence of warrior organisms, the distant, crushing impacts of biotitans that made sensors flicker with minor seismic warnings. His brothers waited for his decision with the patience bred into their bones. They had watched this kind of judgment before, on other doomed worlds, where survival wasn't a miracle but a managed outcome. They trusted Vex. Not all of them liked what trust required. Even among Astartes, some minds recoiled at the brutal simplicity of it. at how easily the protocol reduced human beings into variables to be conserved or discarded. Those doubts were treated as weakness, then trained out with discipline as ruthless as any battlefield drill. Captain Vex did not struggle. Whatever softness remained in him had been carved away long ago. He understood with chilling certainty that sentiment was inefficiency, and inefficiency was death. Emotional attachment blurred decisions. Blurred decisions cost wars. The masses below were not people to him in the way they were to themselves. They were resources. The first phase of the protocol was to calculate the city's maximum defensible population, not how many could physically stand within the walls, but how many could be sustained, protected, organized, and used under siege conditions. Food, water, ammunition, fuel, medicine, shelter. Those factors were balanced against projected duration, expected casualty curves, and the probability of infrastructure failure. Kareth's numbers were unforgiving. With strict rationing and controlled distribution, Turs Majoris could keep roughly 4 billion alive for an estimated half-year siege. That estimate assumed near-perfect logistics, near-total obedience, and no catastrophic interruption to power or water systems. Reality rarely offered perfection, but doctrine demanded planning as if it might. 17 billion were inside the perimeter. 4 billion could be carried through if everything went right. 13 billion were the deficit, living weight that would consume what the protocol deemed necessary to preserve what mattered more. Vex reviewed the results the way he would review ammunition counts. The figures were not cruelty, they were physics. Constraints, limits, individual grief did not enter the equation. Families, dreams, hopes. These were not tactical assets unless they served compliance and output. War did not reward tears. The second phase was prioritization. Not all citizens held equal strategic value. The Imperium had never pretended otherwise. The protocols simply formalized the hierarchy into a system that could be applied quickly, consistently, and without hesitation. At the highest tier were the irreplaceable tech priests and senior engineers who could keep the grid alive, veteran officers and NCOs who could lead auxiliaries, medical personnel able to treat both disease and battlefield trauma, manufactorum specialists who could retool production for war. These people would be protected first, given the safest quarters, given the best equipment, given guards if required. Their families would be elevated as well, not out of kindness, but because cooperation is easier when loyalty has something to lose. Below them came the useful but replaceable, administrators who could run logistics, instructors who could train civil auxiliaries, Vox specialists who could keep communications alive under bombardment, skilled laborers whose hands could be turned to war production. They would receive standard allocations, enough to keep them functional, not enough to threaten the higher tier. Housing would be assigned in sectors with workable defenses. Roles would be designated, expectations made clear. Then came the bulk of the population, subdivided by age, health, and potential utility. Fit young adults could be conscripted. Others could be set to labor. Older citizens with knowledge might advise or train. Children were future value, but in the present they were mouths, not weapons. Assets that cost resources now for uncertain return later. At the bottom sat the category the protocol did not romanticize. The elderly who could not work. The chronically ill. The injured. Those with criminal histories. Those with poor loyalty marks. Those whose psychological profiles suggested panic, disruption, or refusal under pressure. Doctrine was explicit about what happened when the ledger did not balance. In shortage conditions, this group became expendable. Rations redirected. Space reassigned. Evacuation lists closed. Left behind. Brother Sergeant Maximus watched the city's preparations with the calm attention of a professional overseeing a complicated operation. His squad's orders were clear. Enforce preservation measures in the middle sectors where the skilled worker base was concentrated. The mortals moved faster as rumors began to seep through the streets. They didn't understand the full shape of the machine turning above them, but they could feel its gears beginning to bite. The first visible sign was administrative teams going door to door with data slates, taking fresh surveys, jobs, certifications, medical histories, family ties, practical skills. At first, it sounded reasonable, what any government might do in emergency. Then people noticed the pattern. Some citizens were issued small metal tokens. Those tokens opened the doors to special distribution centers where rations were better and lines were shorter. Some families were reassigned to housing blocks closer to the strongest fortifications. Other families were moved away from those areas without explanation. Classification split households. A father marked essential while a mother was not. A healthy teenager pulled aside while a sick grandparent was quietly stamped into a category nobody would name aloud. Children were separated from parents after health assessments that came with no answers and no appeals. And slowly, across Terres Majoris, gratitude began to sour into fear because the people were realizing that the angels had indeed come to save them, but only on terms no one had agreed to. Whispers traveled faster than official notices. In the unlit cuts between hab blocks, people traded the same stories with different names. A neighbor who vanished before dawn, a stairwell sealed by armored figures, an entire residential stack quietly reclassified overnight. Some districts became restricted zones, accessible only to those stamped as essential. Several distribution points stopped serving anyone who couldn't present the right authorization token. For the few whose skills sat high on the hidden list, life abruptly became strange in a different way. Cleaner quarters, steady power, better food, medical attention that appeared the moment it was requested. Their families were folded into protected enclaves and managed with an efficiency so smooth it felt supernatural. But every comfort granted to one household seemed to be paid for by a dozen others. Lines lengthened. Rations thinned. Whole streets were left colder and darker as resources migrated inward, away from people who could not understand the logic controlling their hunger. Captain Vex watched the city shift through compiled reports and silent metrics. To him, the rollout looked textbook. Priorities applied, friction minimized, the organism of the hive guided toward its intended shape. A few scattered flare-ups of anger surfaced, crowds refusing reassignment, workers demanding explanations, yet the appearance of armed space marines ended each incident before it could become a contagion. The population adapted, as Imperial citizens always did. Not because they agreed, but because centuries of rule had trained resignation into the bones of the species. Beyond the walls, the Tyranid scouts closed the gap. Less than 4 hours remained before the outer perimeter would feel the first probing claws. Long-range optics and auger sweeps caught the leading edge of the swarm, pouring over the landscape like a sentient flood, stripping the world as it advanced. It was horrifying, yet in its own way, magnificent. Evolution sharpened into a single function, appetite made perfect. No lens could pick out individuals inside that mass. Instead, the horde revealed itself as patterns. Thermal imaging showed the broad composition. The first wave was a moving carpet of smaller bioforms, termagants and hormagants, in quantities so vast they blurred into one continuous, rippling surface. Behind them came weight. Tyranid warriors moved like a spine within the body, pushing forward with purpose, ready to enforce cohesion and exploit any weakness. Carnifex shapes followed, living siege engines meant to turn barricades into splinters and defenders into panic. Above it all, the sky churned with winged creatures, gargoyles and larger hunting forms that would map the defenses and tear into key positions when the moment presented itself. Farther back, almost swallowed by distance even for enhanced optics, the horizon carried the silhouettes of true monsters, bio-titans that walked like mountains given muscle and malice. The force approaching Terres Majoris was enough to break systems, a density of biomass that spoke of many worlds already devoured. Against that, saving even a fraction of the hive's population would be counted as a victory. Vex initiated the final stage. Not the math, but the enactment. Across the city, public address systems came alive with calm, clipped announcements. The language was measured, authoritative, almost soothing. New emergency procedures, mandatory compliance, for public safety, for the integrity of the defense. Certain HAB zones would be temporarily evacuated to allow construction of additional fortifications. Residents would be relocated to more secure facilities elsewhere. The broadcasts never said where and never said when anyone might return. Food and water distribution would be centralized for efficiency. Citizens were assigned collection windows and directed to report with proper identification and authorization tokens. Anyone without the correct paperwork was instructed to attend processing centers so their status could be verified and appropriate arrangements made. Civilians with critical skills were ordered to mobilization sites immediately, where training and equipment would be issued for their role in the defense. Their families would be housed and protected while they fulfilled their duty to the Imperium. Everything sounded orderly, bureaucracy as lullaby. Yet beneath the clean phrasing was the hard skeleton of the protocol, lives being sorted into value, then moved like pieces on a board. People who understood what words like temporary evacuation often meant in Imperial practice began acting in quiet desperation. Some tried to flee. They loaded ground cars with whatever they could carry and pushed for the exits before the swarm arrived. Patrols intercepted them without theatrics, turning them back with practiced explanations about infiltration risks and compromised routes. The truth was simpler. The protocol required controlled numbers. Too many departures would ruin the allocations. The equation demanded the population stay inside the brackets. Others tried a different path. Deception, bribery, forged claims. They invented skills, exaggerated credentials, bought counterfeit tokens from officials willing to sell their souls for one more day of comfort. It did not work. The Space Marines did not rely on interviews and paper. Biometric screens, gene checks, and psychological profiling tore through lies in minutes. A civilian could fake a story, but not a body, not a mind, not the absence of real competence under stress. A handful saw the shape of the trap clearly enough to resist. They gathered in factories and maintenance tunnels, speaking in low voices about the Marines' true intent, about the relocations, about what the hierarchy really meant. They planned to disrupt the sorting, refuse reassignment, sabotage processing centers, seize distribution points. They never got the chance. Such efforts were detected and dismantled with the same clinical precision used for any tactical obstacle. Organizers vanished during the night. Their circles woke up leaderless, scattered, frightened by how effortlessly their protectors could reach into any corner of the hive. Brother Sergeant Maximus personally led one of the removals. His squad moved through back streets without noise, armor swallowing light, presence felt only when it was too late. Their target was a former PDF colonel who had been stirring defiance in the industrial sectors, warning workers, urging them to refuse the protocol, insisting the angels had come to decide who would be sacrificed. The operation ended almost before it began. The colonel was extracted from his hiding place and taken to a secured facility for interrogation and processing. His followers were left with a lesson written in absence. You cannot outmaneuver creatures built for war. Maximus felt nothing about it. No pride, no disgust. It was maintenance, removing a fault before it spread. The colonel's experience might have been useful, but his refusal to submit made him more dangerous than valuable. Eliminating him improved stability. Stability preserved the plan. As the last hours drained away, the city's new order became unmistakable. Millions were guided, softly at first, then firmly, into assigned zones. Their movement was controlled through incentives, restrictions, and direct force when necessary. High-priority citizens were concentrated in the most defensible inner sectors, surrounded by thicker fortifications and heavier Space Marine presence. Their shelters were real shelters. Lower priority groups were pushed outward into buffer districts. They received basic weapons and the thinnest veneer of training. They were told they would delay and disrupt the Xenos' advance so the core defenses could settle into siege posture. Many believed it. Some even felt proud to be chosen for the front. They did not understand they had been placed to be consumed first. Bodies as time, time as currency. The lowest of the low were directed to vast temporary shelter facilities in the outermost districts. Immense structures capable of holding hundreds of thousands in cramped stacks. Life support existed, barely. Supplies existed, barely. Enough, perhaps, for a handful of days under ideal conditions. What these shelters did not have was meaningful defense. They lacked robust communications. They had no evacuation plan worth the word. They were, in practice, containment sites, places designed to concentrate expendable populations where their loss would not complicate the larger defense. Captain Vex reviewed the final deployment statistics with quiet satisfaction. 17 billion lives had been sorted and positioned according to strategic value with minimal disruption. Resources were redistributed, key personnel secured, unrest suppressed or boxed in. The equation balanced as well as it ever could. The achievement was immaculate. The cost was obscene. 13 billion people had effectively been condemned. Their future reduced to coefficients and probabilities. Their lives written off as a drain on the survival of those deemed more useful. Families were split by classification. Communities were shattered by relocation. Dignity was traded for compliance. But those were not variables the Astartes were designed to weigh. They were not relief workers. They were weapons, built to win. If winning demanded sacrifices, the sacrifices would be made, cleanly and without hesitation. The first tyrannid organisms touched the outer perimeter as the last civilian movements were still being finalized. Small, swift scout creatures tested the line with patient intelligence, probing for weakness like predators tapping a fence for loose wire. They were met by concentrated lass fire from positions manned mostly by expendable civilians, people given the worst posts and the smallest odds, yet fighting with the frantic courage of those who know there is nowhere left to run. Behind the scouts, the main assault gathered, a tide of living blades and muscle preparing to crash into the city's arranged geometry. The assessment was done, the sorting completed. Now the protocol would be tested in blood and smoke. Deep in the most protected bunker, surrounded by high-tier civilians and the densest defensive systems available, Captain Vex watched the tactical feeds with the calm attention of a craftsman observing his own work. The battle for Terce Majoris was about to begin, and every death, every act of bravery, every collapse and every stand would become new data. The protocol would learn from it. Algorithms would be adjusted, thresholds recalibrated for the next world, the next impossible decision. Because in this age, salvation was never abundant. Someone always had to do the math. Gunfire rolled across the hive as the outer line engaged the first true wave. The harsher bark of bolters cut through the chaos at intervals, mixing with the inhuman shrieks of the Xenos. It became a brutal music that promised to continue until one side stopped moving. 17 billion had waited to learn their worth in the eyes of angels. Now they would learn what the angels' calculations could preserve and what the angels had decided could be spent. From a reinforced observation post in Sector 12, Maximus watched through enhanced optics as hormagaunts smashed against the perimeter like a sea of living razors. The civilians holding that line had laser guns and a few hours of instruction, nothing that could truly prepare them for the reality of fighting the great devourer's children face to face. Their voices flooded the Vox. Pleas for ammunition, for medici support, for reinforcements, for anything. Some requests were denied outright by the allocation rules. Others were answered with the minimum required to keep the line functioning without weakening more important operations deeper in the hive. Maximus could pick out individuals within the noise. Marcus Venn, a mid-level clerk whose request for additional power cells was approved because his post controlled an expensive choke point. Sarah Chen, a medical technician begging for extraction. Denied because her sector had already been written off. Each voice was a person, a history, a set of relationships and private hopes. Maximus had all of it in memory, their profiles, their ratings, their classifications. He knew Marcus had children inside the inner secure zone. He knew Sarah volunteered for front-line duty despite her low combat score. He knew both were likely to die within hours. It changed nothing. His conditioning was built to keep the mind clear. Individual casualties were expected losses, already priced into the plan. The outer perimeter held for a little over half an hour before the first major breach. Raveners tunneled beneath the defenses and erupted behind the gun placements, cutting down civilians before they could even understand what had happened. The opening allowed hundreds of smaller bioforms to pour into the outer districts, beginning the systematic weakening of infrastructure and morale. Captain Vex tracked the breach with detached interest. The line had been expected to fail within the first hour. Holding as long as it did registered slightly above projected performance. Useful information. It suggested that imminent death could drive even low-tier defenders to exceed their predicted output. The kind of insight that would make future calculations more accurate. Then urgent reports began arriving from the outer shelter complexes. Those massive, temporary facilities where the lowest priority population had been concentrated. They were meant to keep expendable masses contained and out of the way, sustained at bare minimum until their function, delay, was fulfilled. The Tyranids saw them differently. From orbit, the bioships had mapped the city's organic density with pitiless precision. Those shelters shone on alien sensors like feasting beacons. Enormous stores of biomass gathered in convenient locations. 3 Trigon-class monsters erupted from below the largest shelter, bursting up through floor and foundation in a single catastrophic convulsion. The shelter's token defenses died almost instantly. Hundreds of thousands were trapped inside a structure that became a sealed throat for slaughter. Their screams poured into emergency channels. Requests for rescue, for evacuation, for anything. There was no answer. No resources had ever been assigned for them. Captain Vex received the flood of battlefield updates with the same chill objectivity he gave to any intelligence report. The collapse of the outer shelter complex had never been a surprise. It had been modeled, anticipated, and already folded into the first phase casualty curves. The civilians packed inside had been written off from the start, placed there to draw Tyranid attention, to pull enemy mass and momentum away from targets the protocol considered worth protecting. That their last minutes were filled with panic, confusion, and the taste of betrayal was unfortunate. But to Vex, it was also operationally irrelevant. Wars were not decided by tenderness, they were decided by ruthless selection. Keep what can be kept, spend what must be spent, and accept that survival in an unwinnable calculus requires losses that morality cannot comfortably name. Inside the high-priority residential sectors, the war looked like a different universe. Those districts had been engineered into fortresses, layered barricades, hardened firing lanes, redundant power and life support, and defenders chosen for discipline and proven competence. When Tyranid assault elements tested these lines, they met heavy emplacements firing in coordinated arcs, rapid counterstrikes by Space Marine squads, and defensive routines tailored specifically against Xenos bioweapon patterns. The contrast was deliberate. Citizens with top assessment scores were placed where protection approached the limits of Imperial engineering. Their safety outweighed nearly every other variable. Children continued schooling in reinforced bunkers under instructors selected as much for morale control as for education. Medical care was immediate and high grade. Experienced practitioners, reserved equipment, and supplies that were never meant to reach the general masses. By peacetime measures, it was bleak. By siege reality, it was comfort. They ate on schedule. They slept in climate-managed rooms behind multiple layers of steel and firepower. They received regular briefings, carefully packaged, so confidence stayed intact and panic stayed contained. Most crucially, they were not told what their safety was buying. No one explained the millions dying in the outer zones to purchase time, ammunition, and stability for the preserved few. The protocol included information locks for exactly this reason. Morale among critical personnel was treated as its own strategic stockpile, one that could be poisoned by truth deemed unnecessary to performance. Brother Apothecary Sanguis moved through these protected medical facilities as if he were maintaining a weapon system rather than tending human beings. His enhanced senses caught what ordinary clinicians might miss. Cortisol spikes, subtle malnutrition, the first hairline fractures of psychological collapse. He intervened early because a breakdown, however private, could become a productivity loss, then a morale leak, then a structural weakness. The task was more complicated than battlefield medicine. These civilians were not dying of shrapnel. They were suffering from guilt, from worry for friends and relatives sealed outside the safe ring, from the slow dread of hearing distant fighting while being told everything was under control. These reactions had to be managed before they hardened into disabling disorders. Sanguis used a layered approach. Pharmaceuticals for acute stress, structured counseling to steer emotions into non-disruptive channels, controlled group sessions where trained facilitators redirected conversations away from questions that could ignite unrest, briefings that emphasized favorable developments and blurred setbacks into vague language. It wasn't kindness, it was systems management, human resources kept functional under extreme load. The apothecary took professional pride in keeping the preserved population steady, compliant, and effective despite the pressure crushing the city around them. Outside those fortified pockets, the war sharpened. The Tyranid assault evolved beyond blunt mass charges. The hive mind began maneuvering with unnerving sophistication, showing a growing comprehension of human defenses. Orbital organisms coordinated strikes against key infrastructure, power nodes, relay points, transit arteries, attempting to collapse the city's ability to sustain coordinated resistance. Above the streets, winged bioforms scouted and mapped. They found thin spots, watched firing rhythms, identified where lines bent too far. That knowledge flowed back through the synaptic web, and soon the ground assault changed shape. Attacks started landing on weaknesses with surgical accuracy. The enemy was learning, and the ones caught in the teeth of that learning were the middle-tier civilians, the population considered worth keeping, but not worth maximum protection. Their positions formed the bridge between expendable outer buffers and the heavily defended inner core. That made them ideal targets for Tyranid forces seeking a path inward. They fought hard because they believed their place in the hierarchy depended on holding. They had been told their sacrifice mattered. They had been told endurance would protect something greater. What they were not told was that many of their positions had been chosen precisely because they could be abandoned without collapsing the true defense plan. In Sector 15, Corporal Helena Voss of the civilian auxiliaries crouched behind a barricade built from scrap plating and shattered masonry. Her lasgun barrels smoked from sustained fire. For hours, her unit held the same intersection as hormagaunts kept coming, wave after wave, turning the street into a grinder. Ammunition dwindled. Bodies stacked. Requests for reinforcements went out again and again, each answered with reassurances that never arrived. Through haze and noise, she saw space marines operating nearby, dark giants moving with exact, terrifying efficiency, yet none diverted to her line, despite the intersection's obvious tactical value. At first, she assumed they hadn't heard. Then she wondered if they'd forgotten. The truth was worse than neglect. Voss and her people had been priced into the plan as acceptable losses. Their stand was useful. It slowed the enemy, exposed assault tendencies, and bought consolidation time deeper inside. Their fight was being watched, recorded, measured. When the intersection finally broke under a coordinated multi-direction strike, the data harvested from their last minutes would be archived and fed into future models. Her death and the deaths of everyone beside her would become numbers that improved the protocol. Brother Sergeant Maximus observed Sector 15's fall via tactical overlay, noting timings and assault vectors with professional interest. The defenders had exceeded projections slightly, holding longer than the statistical mean. That variance was valuable. It would tighten future estimates of civilian endurance under sustained contact. His memory indexed the engagement automatically, stacking it alongside countless other battles he had witnessed over centuries. He felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not remorse. They had done what they were assigned to do. They performed within acceptable parameters until the assignment ended the way it was always going to end. At the scale the Imperium fought, this was normal. Individual lives, no matter how precious to themselves, were resources. The Astartes accepted that with a clarity mortals could rarely afford. By the second day, the pattern became visible to anyone sharp enough to connect it. The city's population was being processed like material through a machine. Sorted, moved, consumed, each tier meeting the fate assigned to it long before the first clause touched the outer wall. Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne, a senior xenobiologist classified as high priority, began to understand what she was inside of while working in secured labs deep within the inner zone. Her assignment was critical. Analyze Tyranid samples, search for exploitable weaknesses, feed solutions into the defense. The Imperium spent resources to keep her alive because her mind could save more than her body cost. But scientific training teaches pattern recognition, and that skill became a curse. She noticed who wasn't there, entire categories of people absent from the secure rings. She watched supplies and protection flow according to a logic that didn't always match immediate tactical needs, but matched something colder, long-term preservation value. She began to suspect that she and her colleagues were not merely protected, they were curated, preserved like assets. The realization tasted like complicity. She was safe because others, no less human, no less deserving, had been designated expendable by an equation she never authored and could not challenge. Her value bought her oxygen while millions suffocated under the weight of the protocol. The knowledge was unbearable. Yet she had no clean exit. If she protested, she would change nothing except her own classification and possibly disrupt the only defense that might save anyone. If she refused to work, the expendables would still die, and the research that might blunt the swarm would die with her. So she continued, each finding about Tyranid anatomy feeling like a betrayal of those sacrificed to keep her hands steady and her lab powered. Captain Vex monitored these psychological traces as he monitored all performance indicators within the protected zones. Hawthorne's moral stress sat within tolerable range. Output remained high. No immediate intervention required. If her efficiency dropped, protocols existed. Chemical adjustments to mute disruptive emotions, reconditioning to reshape perspective, and, if necessary, memory alteration to remove burdensome recollections and replace them with more operationally useful mental content. To Vex, these were maintenance procedures. The mind was another system. Systems required tuning. Then the tactical situation worsened. Reports from the outer sectors came in rapid succession. More Tyranid assets committed to the ground war. Carnifex-class monsters began hammering middle-tier defenses directly, organic artillery punching through reinforced structures. Winged swarms took control of the air across much of the city, overwhelming thin anti-air coverage. Without sky protection, ground forces became vulnerable to strikes arriving from angles no wall could anticipate. Most disturbing of all, the hive mind seemed to be reading the city's logic. The Tyranids began prioritizing targets as if they understood the protocol itself, focusing fire on high-value concentrations instead of consuming indiscriminately. That implied a level of battlefield interpretation beyond what the original calculations had assumed. If the enemy could identify and erase priority populations with precision, then the entire foundation of the assessment strategy cracked. Sacrificing outer groups would become meaningless if the preserved core could be surgically removed anyway. Vex responded immediately. He initiated adaptive countermeasures, moving critical personnel between locations to break recognizable patterns, building decoy facilities to poison enemy reconnaissance, altering communications routines to obscure command structures. Additional screening and defensive layers were deployed around the highest value zones. These measures cost resources the original plan had not budgeted. So Vex rebalanced the equation the only way the protocol allowed. He downgraded certain middle-tier populations, quietly reclassifying them as expendable, freeing up manpower and equipment to harden protection around the most critical assets. There was no announcement, no consultation. The affected civilians would learn their new status the moment supplies stopped arriving. Deep within the palace, Brother Codicarius Malphus of the Angel's Sanguinary Librarium stood in a sealed meditation chamber, reaching outward through the warp to sense the approaching hive fleet. He felt the familiar horror that came with Tyranids, the shadow in the warp, an oppressive null that smothered psychic perception into dead silence. Yet even within that void, subtle structures could be teased out by a skilled battle psyker. Faint echoes, alien priorities, the rhythm of an intelligence that did not think like men, yet learned faster than men could react. What Malphus perceived fed a growing unease. The Tyranids were not merely feeding, they were studying. They were learning the Imperium's logic, the predictable behaviors created by doctrine, hierarchy, and systematic resource allocation. The assessment protocol, with its neat categories and consistent patterns, was producing exactly the kind of structured signal the hive mind excelled at exploiting. Every orderly decision created a readable trail. Every personnel movement, every supply reroute, every efficient choice formed patterns an alien intellect could map, predict, and counter, at speeds that made human planning feel slow and brittle. The protocol's greatest strength, its cold, repeatable efficiency, was also becoming its weakness. The Codicarius pushed his warning through the psychic lattice that bound the Space Marine command chain together. The message hit like a hard pulse of urgency. Less a suggestion than a tactical alarm. Captain Vex accepted it with the same disciplined focus he gave any frontline report. Yet the consequence was immediate. Priorities had to be rechecked, assumptions rescored. If the assessment protocol was turning their defense into something readable, something the hive mind could model, then the protocol itself had become a liability. But altering it was not simple. The very reason the system functioned at planetary scale was because it was systematic. It turned chaos into procedure. It reduced billions into manageable categories. Remove that structure entirely, and the defense risked collapsing under its own administrative weight. So Vex chose a third option, not abandonment, but contamination. They would inject randomness, not the soft randomness of human error, but deliberate inconsistency introduced as doctrine. Assignments would occasionally violate the hierarchy. Supplies would sometimes be routed inefficiently on purpose. Movements would include contradictions that sacrificed best placement in exchange for being harder to predict. The goal wasn't to improve immediate outcomes. The goal was to break the enemy's ability to learn. Vex understood the cost. Randomness would bleed efficiency. Efficiency was the backbone of preservation. Casualties would rise, among the expendable, among the valuable, among everyone. Yet the alternative was worse. Complete tactical transparency, a defense plan the hive mind could anticipate and dismantle step by step. He authorized the randomization protocols anyway. The survival math had just become uglier, an equation with extra variables, competing constraints, and probabilities that would strain even an Astarte's engineered cognition. The first disruptions took effect as the siege pushed deeper, when Tyranid pressure reached the middle-tier lines and began peeling away the city's secondary perimeter. Without warning, some high-priority personnel were reassigned into less secure zones. At the same time, selected groups previously stamped as expendable were shifted into better protected facilities. It made no sense within the protocol's original logic, and that was the point. The changes confused civilians and irritated lower-ranking Marines tasked with enforcing them. Families separated by earlier classifications were abruptly reunited, while others saw their improved status reversed overnight with no explanation, no appeal, no narrative that could make it feel coherent. The psychological damage was immediate. What little stability people had built around the rules began to crack. If the hierarchy could be rewritten at random, then nothing was predictable, nothing fair, nothing earned. Anxiety rose, compliance weakened, cooperation became reluctant, brittle, and laced with suspicion. But tactically, the payoff arrived quickly. Tyrannid strikes that had been sharpening toward high-value targets started to lose their edge. Assaults that once looked eerily informed became less precise, as if the hive mind was lunging at shapes that no longer matched what it expected. Attack efficiency dropped when Xeno's forces committed to positions that turned out to be distractions, decoys, or simply less critical than their analysis had indicated. The randomization did what it was designed to do. It poured static into both sides of the battle. Human operations became messier, less elegant, yet Tyrannid adaptation suffered more. Confusion, deliberately embraced, became a weapon. Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne felt that weapon cut into her life directly. One moment she worked inside a secure laboratory deep in the inner ring. The next, she was transferred to a research station in a contested middle sector, an exposed node with thinner defenses and unreliable supply. The official reasoning spoke of redistribution and necessity, but she could see the mechanism beneath the words. She was being used as noise. Her new facility was worse in every measurable way. Equipment was inferior. Samples arrived late or damaged. The station's output could not match what she had produced under protection. The move violated every rational principle that had once justified labeling her as high priority. And yet, as she settled into the hazardous new post, she observed something unsettling. Tyrannid assaults against research sites no longer landed with the same uncanny accuracy. Earlier, the enemy had seemed able to sniff out and strike the most important scientific nodes almost at will. Now their hits were sloppier, more scattered, less discriminating. The strategy was working. Her increased personal risk, her reduced productivity, even the possibility of her death. These were accepted costs, because her very unpredictability made it harder for the hive mind to concentrate force against truly critical targets. She might die. Yes, but she would die in a way that didn't help the enemy refine its aim. The moral implications were nauseating. The assessment protocol had once killed by ranking. People died because the system judged them low value. Now people died because their deaths were tactically useful as misdirection, not worthless, but expendable as camouflage. Human lives weren't just resources anymore. They were interference patterns. Hawthorne kept working anyway. Grim, stubborn determination replaced hope. Her findings could still matter. Even with weaker tools and greater danger, any useful insight into Tyrannid biology might save someone, somewhere, later in the siege. As the next day arrived, losses surpassed every initial forecast. Randomization had blunted Tyrannid pattern analysis, but it also eroded the defender's own coordination. Vex found himself constantly adjusting parameters, tightening here, loosening there, trying to keep unpredictability high enough to confuse the enemy without letting his own war machine dissolve into pure disorder. Meanwhile, civilians began to grasp fragments of the truth. In contested sectors, rumors grew into a rough understanding. Fates were being decided by calculations no one could see, and now those calculations seemed to contradict themselves. Some civilians attempted to play the chaos, behaving in ways they thought might trigger favorable reassignment. Others surrendered to fatalism, recognizing that there was no lever they could pull that mattered. A few, the observant, the analytical, saw the wider pattern. They understood they weren't simply refugees in a siege. They were variables in a live experiment, human behavior and allocation methods being tested against an enemy intelligence that learned from patterns faster than it could be outrun. That realization was terrifying, and in a warped way, it was liberating. If everything was calculation, then personal guilt became less intimate. just another consequence of living inside an equation. During the fourth night, reinforcements arrived. Brother Captain Thaddeus of the Angels' sanguinary First Company. His strike cruiser translated from the warp into the contested orbital space above the planet, bringing a commander who had seen too many worlds attempt the same kind of arithmetic and fail. His mission was not to fight on the line. It was to judge the strategy itself, whether the protocol should continue, mutate further, or be discarded. Thaddeus assessed the situation with a veteran's cold clarity. Yes, the protocol had achieved what it claimed, billions preserved behind hard defenses, critical personnel kept alive, key resources protected longer than conventional approaches would have managed. But the bill was horrific. Middle and lower tier losses were climbing past what the city could absorb. Worse, the growing need for randomness was dissolving the very efficiency that made the protocol viable in the first place. He convened an emergency council. Vex defended his implementation with numbers, preservation rates, modeled comparisons, statistical arguments that the method had delivered better outcomes than tradition could promise. Malthus provided psychic intelligence. The hive mind was still adapting, already learning to respond even to engineered inconsistency. Korith delivered infrastructure truth. Systems were failing faster than predicted. Power, transport, comms, stress fractures spreading. If nothing changed, collapse was a matter of days. The picture was brutally clear. The assessment protocol was both saving and bleeding them. It preserved what mattered, while burning through the city's ability to keep defending. Its logic made it strong. Its logic made it readable. Thaddeus faced the defining command problem. Keep a method that works but grows more exploitable by the hour, or abandon the elegance for something uglier, something less efficient, yet harder to predict and easier to sustain. The council evaluated options without romance. Criteria were weighed: tactical effect, resource sustainability, unpredictability, long-term survival outcomes. They reached their conclusion the way Space Marines always did, through probability and necessity, not grief. They would abandon the assessment protocol. In its place would be a flexible allocation doctrine. Fluid, reactive, improvisational at scale. Priority ladders would be dissolved. Resources would flow according to immediate battlefield requirement rather than fixed rankings. It would preserve fewer lives, almost certainly, but it would avoid producing consistent patterns for the enemy to exploit. The decision carried an unspoken poison. It made the first days feel meaningless. The billions who died as buffers and delays had not purchased a sustainable defense. Their deaths had been part of a tactical trial, data gathered, assumptions tested, only for the method to be discarded as the enemy adjusted. Vex received the order with discipline. He had executed his mandate with brutal efficiency under impossible conditions. Its cancellation was not an admission of incompetence. It was adaptation to a changing battlefield. The transition began at once, rapid, clean, and paradoxically organized. Classifications were nullified. Assignments were reshuffled for immediate need. Supply systems were rewired to support constant reallocation. The hierarchy that had structured the city's fear was dissolved overnight. The civilians' reaction was immediate and violent in its own quiet way. Those who had accepted their place in the old order were thrown into uncertainty. Some welcomed the change, especially the ones previously marked for disposal who suddenly saw better protection and food. Others, particularly those who'd lived in the high-priority ring, felt it as betrayal, not because anyone promised them anything, but because they had assumed the rules would keep favoring them. Dr. Hawthorne watched the dissolution with conflicting relief and dread. The old system was monstrous, but it had a logic she could understand. The new one offered no clarity, only shifting survival odds. She continued her work, now painfully aware that her expertise was merely one factor among many, and her protection could vanish the moment the tactical map changed. The moral weight didn't disappear, it changed shape. Before, she lived because others were sacrificed for her category. Now, anyone could be sacrificed at any time for reasons that would never be explained. The uncertainty was horrifying, yet it felt, in a bleak way, more honest about what they truly were, pieces in a war they could not control. Brother Sergeant Maximus moved his squad through contested middle sectors, enforcing the new doctrine. The work was harder than following a fixed protocol. It demanded constant reassessment, immediate decisions, adaptation hour by hour. But it was more responsive, allowing defenses to shift as quickly as Tyranid pressure shifted without the drag of predetermined hierarchies. Civilians became tactical assets, evaluated continuously. Skills were leveraged on demand. Assignments changed in real time. The method wasted resources compared to the old model, but it could pivot, and pivoting was the only language a hive mind respected. Maximus observed with professional interest. Enemy pattern analysis seemed degraded by the lack of consistent structure, yet human coordination also suffered. The trade-off, predictability versus efficiency, played out in blood, with casualties serving as the only honest scoreboard. As the siege pushed into its 5th day, a darker truth became visible to anyone with enough perspective. This had never been a single plan. It was a process. The assessment protocol wasn't meant to be permanent. It was one phase in an adaptive method, testing structured allocation, then testing flexible improvisation, measuring outcomes against an enemy that learned. The billions fighting and dying on Terres Majoris were participants in a field experiment, their lives turned into variables inside a doctrine refinement cycle that would be carried to other worlds. The realization was sickening and strangely comforting. Their suffering wasn't meaningless in the narrow sense. It produced knowledge. It strengthened future defenses. It sharpened the Imperium's understanding of how to resist the Great Devourer. They were not only victims of alien hunger. They were fuel for doctrine. Captain Vex returned to the highest spire of the governor's palace, watching the tactical picture as the siege approached a turning point. The flexible strategy showed promise. Tyranid targeting grew less effective as human behavior became harder to model. But the cost climbed toward the unbearable. Losses soared, resource consumption spiked. Without strict prioritization, waste multiplied, and the city's endurance shortened. Vex began to consider a thought that felt like blasphemy to a mind built on mathematics. Perhaps any rational decision system, rigid or flexible, still generated patterns an advanced alien intelligence could learn. Perhaps true defense required something beyond calculation, beyond optimization, beyond the comfort of logic itself. Then a new development emerged. Reports indicated the hive mind was shifting approach, moving away from precise targeting and back toward raw consumption. Less chess, more flood. The change suggested their experiments had disrupted Tyranid analysis enough to force a simpler method. That was a victory of sorts. It was also a warning. A less precise enemy would be more chaotic, more violent, more indiscriminate. The battlefield would become uglier, less predictable even for the defenders, because the Xenos would pursue maximum biomass and maximum destruction rather than clever angles of exploitation. The final phase was approaching. All the protocols, the revisions, the cleverness of the last 5 days would be tested against the oldest law in the galaxy: hunger. Captain Vex prepared for that collision. Mathematical warfare slamming into a biological imperative evolved for nothing but growth. And across Terres Majoris, 17 billion souls waited for the last verdict, an ultimate calculation rendered by angels who had turned human lives into variables, and were now facing an enemy that might not care about variables at all.